The sleepy South Florida town of Vero Beach was home to a string of mysterious disappearances.
We have 3 people that are missing, no suspects, no witnesses, and no leads.
The perpetrators were family who shared a twisted fantasy.
It seems that these two had a secret hidden perversion.
Their sights set on snaring human prey.
I did see something in the hunting styles that would later show up in their hunting of the victims.
So what was motivating them to murder?
If you believe evil spirits could get in people, there's certainly one in him.
And were these killing cousins born to kill? In the 1980s, the Florida town of Vero Beach was known for little more than its abundance of sun, sea, and swamps.
Vero Beach had basically 2 sides. On one side there was the beaches. On the other side there was miles and miles of agriculture. So you had bikinis on one side and swamps on the other.
A lot of people referred to Vero as Zero Beach because it was a small community.
However, the afternoon of the 26th of July 1983 would send shockwaves through the tranquil seaside community. Teenage friends Lynn Elliott and Reagan Martin were planning a day out.
Lynn was a beautiful young woman, smart. She was getting ready to graduate from high school. She was passionate about her friends. She just had several nice friends, and they used to come by the house. Reagan was a new friend. They would have fun, and you could hear them laughing. We only lived 2 blocks from the beach, so they were over there almost every day. My son Brian and my son Jason and Lynn were over there, and we didn't worry about them then. You let them go, they come back, tell them when to come back, and that's it. I got back about 5 o'clock, and Brian was there, and I asked Brian, I said, well, where's Lynn? He says, well, she was at the beach with us, and she and Reagan were out there, standing out there hitchhiking, and I told them not to do it.
The young girl's decision to hitch a ride gave Carl great cause for concern.
And I said, well, I'm beginning to worry. It was like 5 o'clock then, you know. And I said, she should be home.
That same afternoon, a teenage boy was on his way home from a friend's house when he witnessed a disturbing scene.
I heard this screaming, and this man was chasing this young girl, or lady. Then I saw him dragging her back towards the house, and I heard 2 shots.
This sinister sighting would be the climax of a twisted tale that had begun in mysterious circumstances 2 years earlier. The Ling family had recently moved to Vero Beach, emigrating from their native Taiwan. Working in one of the many orange groves in the town, the father, Pu Ling, was befriended by Vero local Robert Lindsay.
Pu Ling was just the kind of person that you couldn't help but like. The daughter, whose name was Inghua, was just as sweet as she could be, and an honor student in math.
But on the 19th of February 1981, 17-year-old Inghua and her mother, Shang Huang, suddenly disappeared from their home.
We contacted everybody that knew Pooling, and we had 20, 30 people, just friends and family out looking. But the problem was we really didn't know where to look. It was like a needle in a haystack.
Detective Phil Redstone received a call alerting him to the troubling mystery.
We did an inspection of the house and found all the personal property, purse of the mother located on a table just inside the door. A vacuum cleaner that was right inside the front door that was still plugged into the wall. Looked like someone was vacuuming the house at the time and left it right in the middle of the walk area. No signs of a struggle or any kind of anything disturbed in the house that was out of the ordinary.
Frustratingly, Detective Redstone had very little evidence to work with.
There wasn't another house within a mile of where they lived, so there was no witnesses at all that had seen anything. So as far as having any suspects, I mean, we were completely in the dark.
Yet the Lings would not be the last women to vanish. The predator hunting women in Vero Beach had only just begun. In 1981, the disappearance of mother and daughter, Shang and Inghua Ling, would disturb the peace in the rural Florida town of Vero Beach.
It really unnerved the community, and it just seemed unlikely that anything but foul play had happened.
It gets frustrating as time goes by, and then you're having nothing to work on, and then you're kind of in the situation where, is this an isolated incident, or is something else going to happen?
6 months later, detectives' fears were realized as they faced another mystery.
Judy K. Daly was a Fort Pierce resident who had grown up around here and had relocated out to California. So she was here visiting family. She had taken her 2 daughters to a nearby beach and dropped them off. It was real popular with teenagers. You know, it wasn't really a place that parents like to hang out. She went to a more secluded area of the beach to hang out by herself, and then she just disappeared.
Phil Redstone would again be called to begin an investigation.
When the officers first arrived, they found the car parked over to the side by itself, no other vehicles in the park. The officers checked the vehicle to make sure that there was no occupants. Checked the beach area, see if there was anyone on the beach or anyone that might be a witness to Judy K. Daly being here.
However, indications of foul play soon became apparent.
No one had seen her. There was no evidence of any of her blankets, personal items, or anything else on the beach. Only the vehicle in the parking lot. We decided to take the vehicle into custody and impound the vehicle, and noticed when the vehicle had been altered to prevent it from being started.
Working in the orange groves near the sites of both disappearances was David Gore, a 27-year-old local man who was watching the unfolding investigation with interest.
David Gore was a native of the Vero Beach area. His parents, Alva and Velma, seemed to have a very normal childhood. He grew up with a sister. Father was a hard-working man, had a good reputation around town.
David's father became a citrus manager in the citrus industry. At that point in time, there wasn't a whole lot to do between growing up in Vero Beach. Your family either got involved in the citrus industry or got involved in some kind of service industry. So David was quite familiar with the citrus groves and the swamps and the different areas of Vero Beach.
While the Gore family were prominent members of the local community, their outward appearance disguised peculiar behaviors at home.
His mother used to read the Bible to him all the time. Although it was strange how she did, She would set him on her lap when she had only thing she had on were her panties and bra, and she would read the Bible to him.
As he grew older, David would form a powerful bond with his cousin, Fred Waterfield.
They were first cousins, but they were more like brothers. They hung around a lot. He looked to Fred as a mentor and kind of mimicked a lot of his behavior.
Phil Williams recalls the days he spent with Gore at high school.
David was always a real laid-back type of person, and during those days, we did a lot of hunting. David knew all the good hunting areas. He knew all the areas where you could have a lot of undisturbed activities. In other words, there wasn't anybody going to catch you doing what you were doing. And David knew several isolated areas like that.
Gore's cousin, Fred Waterfield, often joined the hunt.
Myself and Freddie and David went and did a lot of wild game, mostly rabbit hunting in the groves and different things like that, quails, and it was pretty innocent.
In high school, Waterfield was a leader, while Gore would typically follow.
Freddie, it seemed like, was always planning something. Freddie liked to go and chase vehicles and throw grapefruits at the window and then have the owners turn around and chase them down. What he called it was fun. In order for Freddie to be having fun, the feelings of the other person weren't necessary to be good ones.
The pair quickly realized that they shared a twisted interest.
It seems that these two had a secret hidden perversion between the two of them that they discovered amongst each other at a very early age. As teenagers, they were looking at his sister and her body, looking at Fred's mother, and I think she had a sheer blouse on one time. And they were both commenting on, the arousal that they got from looking at that. And they both realized at an early age that they kind of had a little bit of a deviant appetite for sexual activity.
By age 18, Gore and Waterfield's desire to explore the darker side of sex could no longer be contained.
One of the first sexual encounters that the two of them did together was assaulting David's sister. And I believe she was about 16 years old when this happened, and David held her down while Fred raped her.
It's very likely that they turned to a family member because they believed they could easily control her. Gore and Waterfield were close, fast, and particularly intimate in their closeness. So they probably shared fantasies, sexual fantasies. They probably experimented with various things and then eventually decided to assault one of their family members. So she was kind of the sacrificial lamb.
The pair would continue to delve deeper into the fantasies they shared, strengthening the sadistic bond they had built. In 1976, Angela Hamel claims she called on her mechanic, Fred Waterfield, to help her with some flat tires. Yet instead of taking her to his repair shop, she said he headed deep into the orange groves, where David Gore was lying in wait.
David didn't really speak much. He just looked. He had this stare, like evil look, and creepy. They both looked at me and they started to laugh, but their eyes, it was kind of like they had an undisclosed power connection. That's when David said, okay, we're ready to do this now. And Fred just looked, and he was like getting worked up, like he enjoyed this. That's when Fred grabbed me. And he reached over into the glove compartment. That's for the first time when I saw a gun.
Angela recalls that both Gore and Waterfield then repeatedly raped her.
The next thing I felt was something cold on my body. It was a knife. David said, okay, we'll cut her up and feed her to the alligators. And that's when Fred looked, still was the gun in his hand, David was the knife, and David was totally confused. He acted like that part wasn't rehearsed or something.
Angela claims she was ultimately driven home and sworn to secrecy.
I guess there was a reason God didn't let me die, that I didn't get killed. You know, I'm grateful for it. I still don't know the reason, but I'm thankful, and I thank God every day.
5 years later, in 1981, 3 women would mysteriously go missing in Vero Beach. 4 months after the Lings had vanished, Auxiliary Sheriff's Deputy David Gore became a suspect in their disappearance after carrying out an unauthorized and highly suspicious traffic stop on an 18-year-old girl.
He told her that there had been a robbery in the neighborhood and her car matched the description of a possible suspect. So he took her driver's license and asked her to follow him to a location so someone could identify her car.
When you get down to this isolated road, there was a gentleman down there that was fishing. So he goes back to the girl in the car and said, I just got a radio call and they located the suspect and you're free to go. Based on the circumstances of him making a traffic stop, taking this girl into an isolated area, it would lead you to believe that he was trying to kidnap someone and take them from against their will.
Gore was subsequently fired from the sheriff's department, but his former colleagues would continue to keep a keen eye on him.
Now we're starting to look at him, you know, what is his involvement? We're starting to see him around and is starting to become more aware of his presence.
As detectives worked to connect Gore with the cases of the missing women, his actions would continue to draw their attention.
Marilyn Owens was parked here and was going to see her family physician. Went into the doctor's office, was returning to her car in the parking lot. And when she was walking up to the car, she noticed a head bop up from the back seat. At the same time, one of our deputies was also here at the same doctor's office. Marilyn Owens stopped our police officer and told her that there was someone hiding out in the back seat of her car. The officer found David Gore hiding in the back seat with his shirt off, had an alcoholic beverage in his hand. He also had a handgun, a police scanner, and also handcuffs with him in the back seat of the car.
Charged with attempted kidnap and taken into custody, investigators now look to link David Gore to the still unsolved Ling and Daly cases.
We had obtained a warrant to take into possession his vehicle, and the forensic search of the vehicle revealed that there was some hair and fibers that were able to link to the Ling case.
The evidence appeared damning, yet authorities believed it would not be enough to prove his involvement beyond all reasonable doubt.
You're almost sure that he's the one that's responsible. And if you can't arrest him, you know this, it's just a matter of time till he does it again. If you don't have the evidence, you can't just make up a case and just arrest him on suspicion. You need to be able to tie it all together.
Ultimately, Gore was convicted of trespass against Marilyn Owens and handed a 5-year sentence. David Gore's difficulties in approaching the opposite sex had been evident since his days at high school.
David was very bashful and more or less kind of a rednecky and never really showed that much interest in girls. The one girlfriend that he did have actually at one point in time then decided that she would rather be with me and started then dating me because she said that David was like a good friend and he had no inspiration to ever even try to kiss her or do anything along that line.
In complete contrast, David's cousin, Fred Waterfield, was a prolific ladies' man.
Fred was very popular in high school. He was a very athletic guy, very tall, good looking. He really liked the girls liked him. He had a very easygoing personality. It was a lot more assertive.
Freddie was always after girls.
Always dating, always, always had a female on his mind and always had a way to get one. I think that Freddie's domineering personality at some point in time and his constant success with the girls and constant probably played a part in David's desires developing into the state that they did.
Gore may have actually been jealous of Waterfield. Waterfield was a fairly popular adolescent, not Gore. Gore was a kind of a weird and unusual guy who was not popular, but Waterfield was. And there may have been an underlying jealousy of Gore towards Waterfield.
Later in life, Gore's repeated rejections would fuel his aggressive pursuit of women, made evident in his attempt to kidnap Marilyn Owens. Having served just 18 months in prison, David Gore was set to be released. The residents of Vero Beach were about to face his wrath once more. Following the attempted kidnap of Vero Beach resident Marilyn Owens in 1981, David Gore had been imprisoned for 18 months. However, police had also suspected his involvement in the disappearance of 3 local women, and as the end of his prison term approached, detectives were preparing themselves for his release.
We received notification from the state prison system that he was going to be released within 30 days. So we had a heads up that he was getting ready to come back in the community. So we decided to set up some surveillance on David once he was released to kind of monitor his activities. But again, we knew that sooner or later something else was going to happen. This was not going to stop.
The afternoon of the 26th of July 1983, when Lynn Elliott and Reagan Martin failed to return home from the beach, Lynn's father grew increasingly worried.
I talked to my son Brian and I says, she should be home. He says, I told him, Dad, not to do it. That was a terrible, terrible feeling.
That same day, Detective Phil Redstone decided to conduct some surveillance.
I just had this sudden urge that I needed to get out of the office and I needed to go by David Gore's house. About halfway from the sheriff's office headquarters to the Gore house, I hear a call coming over the police radio where a young man riding his bicycle home from school had observed something. I knew who I was looking for. I knew where to go.
The boy riding his bike had reported a sighting of a screaming girl being chased down by a man with a gun. Responding to the call, Phil Redstone arrived outside the family home of David Gore.
When we first arrived at the scene, I arrived with 2 uniformed officers. There's 3 of us that arrived at the same time. We went down the driveway, and at that time, then we surrounded the house and waited for other units to arrive.
Redstone was joined at the scene by Detective Williams. After hours of attempting negotiations, the pair of officers approached the property with caution.
There were people behind every palm tree, so to speak, with a gun trained on the house. I went to the door of the garage, and I began yelling in, "David, it's Phil, come on out," thinking that the friendship would maybe still have some meaning to it.
As Phil Williams appealed to his former colleague to come quietly, his attention was drawn towards the car parked in the garage.
I noticed blood dripping out of the vehicle that had obviously just been pulled into the driveway. We busted the trunk open, and there was a teenage female shot and tied up in the trunk of the vehicle.
The body was that of Lynn Elliott.
You never forget seeing something like that. And shaking her and see if you can't get some life. You never forget that.
Carl Elliott would soon learn the fate of his daughter Lynn.
I got a knock on the door, and it was a detective from the sheriff's department. And he had the bad news for me. Told me they had found her body in the trunk. And it was just unbelievable. How could this happen to my daughter? Especially in a small town like Vero Beach. We felt safe there. And now all of a sudden all that is gone.
That was actually, for me, the first time I realized that David was not the David that I grew up with. He was a monster. And from there, the monster had to be stopped.
As authorities closed in to make an arrest, they eventually found Gore hiding in the loft. To the surprise of authorities, he was not alone.
I think he knew at that point there was no way out. We were lucky we were able to secure a second victim.
Gore's hostage was Reagan Martin, who had been hitchhiking from the beach with Lynn Elliott.
When Reagan was rescued, she was hysterical. It was really difficult at first for her to tell them exactly what had happened, but she was able to piece it together. She said that they were taken to separate bedrooms and that Gore had raped the both of them.
She said that she knew that Lynn was trying to escape. She heard the front door slam, and that's when she saw David run out of her room. And Lynn was running up that road the best she could, still being partially bound. David chasing her, and then he shot her about 3/4 the way up the driveway to the main road. And that's what the young man saw on his bicycle, was David chasing the girl and then hearing the gunshots.
While further recounting her ordeal, Reagan Martin stunned investigators with the revelation that David Gore had a partner in crime who had already fled the scene.
She told police officers that David Gore had someone else with him, and she identified Fred Waterfield as being the man that drove the vehicle that took him to the house and also escorted them into the house and put them in separate bedrooms.
Fred Waterfield was found at his auto repair shop, just half a mile from the Gore house. Phil Williams recalls his former classmate's behavior as he brought him in for questioning.
During that ride, Freddie was almost visibly shaking, and very, very nervous. And he became as though he was not there with me. He was focused on something he was thinking about very strongly. And as a matter of fact, looking down the roadway, he said, if that son of a bitch gets me in trouble, I'll kill him.
At the sheriff's department, Reagan Martin picked both Gore and Waterfield out of a lineup, identifying them as her attackers. Under questioning, David Gore would come forward with further admissions of guilt, confessing to the unsolved murders of the Lings and Judy K. Daly, of which he had long been suspected. The details of his entrapment of the Lings unmasked David Gore as a cold-blooded predator.
He had been stalking the teenage girl for a couple of weeks. He did surveillance on the house and found out that she was home alone for probably about 45 minutes. What David didn't know was that her mother now was coming into town for a holiday. When he went to the house, he went and used his police badge. He had told the mother and the daughter that he needed to take them into questioning to the police department about something that happened in the neighborhood. And then he had handcuffed them and put them in his truck. They were taken to a shack out in the Grove area that he had access to. He called Fred Waterfield, told them he had 2 women here, and they had the activity they were looking for the weekend.
Gore would also explain how he disabled Judy Daly's car and then lay in wait before making his move.
When she got in her car wouldn't start up. David said he got in his vehicle, drove over, showed him his badge, and said, could he offer any assistance if her car was broke down? And he tried to start it, wouldn't start, so he offered her to give her a ride. And that's how he got her in the car. Then he pulls a gun on her, takes her out to the shack out in the Orange Groves west of town.
This wasn't just snatching somebody. These were thought-through, planned abductions. Gore had a murder kit, brought it with him, and it shows the level of planning that was involved. These were not spontaneous, impulsive, spur-of-the-moment abductions and murders. They were done in a fairly sophisticated way.
Gore claimed he was then joined by Waterfield while they carried out their crimes. Yet his apparent co-conspirator would strongly dispute the allegations.
Fred Waterfield says that he was framed by David Gore, that he might have known about some of these things, but he never participated in the murders, and that David lied repeatedly to make him look like a perpetrator when, in fact, he was not.
Shockingly, Gore went on to reveal 2 more slayings, claiming he and Waterfield had kidnapped and murdered teenage hitchhikers Barbara Bayer and Angelica LaValle.
At this point in time, police knew that they had a stone-cold serial killer on their hands, of the likes they had never seen in this region before.
As the trial approached, David Gore took authorities to the Groves where he had worked, promising to lead them to the bodies of his victims.
I had ridden out there with Phil Rudstone, so we were in a particular area, and he had one of those metal probes in the ground, and he was probing around, and he hit something solid. So he took a brush and just brushed the dirt away. Looking at us was a set of teeth.
The remains were that of Barbara Bayer. Over the following days, Gore would go on to disclose the gravesite locations of the other missing women.
Initially in the Lings case, he said after they were murdered, he put them in 55-gallon drums, buried them. Judy K. Daly, he had dismembered her body, disposed again in another location in the Grove, part of her body. The other part of her body he disposed in the marshland out west of town. And Miss LaValle was disposed of in the marshland, same place as Judy K. Daly's body was dumped.
I looked in his eyes while we were doing the digging, and I mean, I never saw a set of eyes like that. They looked like, I suppose, the eyes of the devil would look like. If you believe evil spirits could get in people, there's certainly one in him.
Investigators would soon dig deeper into the minds of Gore and Waterfield, searching for an explanation behind the pair's desire for depravity. In 1983, David Gore and Fred Waterfield were arrested in connection with a string of mystery disappearances and brutal murders in the town of Vero Beach, Florida. While Waterfield pleaded his innocence, Gore confessed to the slayings of 6 women and in the process revealed the cousins' M.O.
David was the bad guy and Fred was the good guy. And Fred did most of the talking, and he would try to get the girls calm. But eventually, Gore would use his bad guy routine and get them to go where they wanted them to go. Have sex with them till a certain point, then they would kill them.
Phil Williams believes parallels could be drawn between their practice of trapping their victims and the way they hunted game as youngsters.
Freddie would once tell me that he'd rather hunt with me because I liked going after the game. David's hunting style was sort of boring. He would rather wait and for the game to come to him. What I was seeing at the Lynn Elliott abduction on the beach, that was Freddie's hunting style. What I was seeing waiting at the Ling house is David's hunting style.
Most sexual murder individuals commit murder alone. These are very personal things. These are very private things. They do it solo. Sometimes because of that, you'll see 2 different patterns of behavior at the crime scene. One somewhat sophisticated and a less sophisticated pattern of behavior as well.
Although Waterfield had barely been on the investigators' radar, Gore claimed his cousin was in fact the ringleader.
After Gore was caught, he talked about being the weak one. He was the compliant accomplice, according to his story. But his behavior tells another story. The fact that he ended up becoming an auxiliary officer indicates more dominant personality right off the bat. So I believe that they were co-equal to some extent, but that Gore was truly a leader in the sadism.
Despite gaining closure on these long unsolved cases, questions still remained about the origins of the cousins' evil. David Gore would look to his childhood to explain his desire for depravity.
When he was a toddler, he fell into an ant bed and was bitten quite severely, particularly around his head and face. And they did have to rush him to the doctors for treatment. And he developed a very high temperature, and it burned his brain. And he was never quite right in the head after that.
It seemed that he did change a bit after that incident, so that probably he did have some neurological damage that affected his ability to make moral choices, to inhibit his behavior, to be aggressive. I would say it's likely that that brain damage that he had was part of becoming a killer. And especially if you're in a team where the other guy wants to do it too, not only is your brain giving you permission, but you have a buddy who's also giving you permission.
Phil Williams believes Fred Waterfield's apparent obsession with sex drove him to take women by force.
Freddie was always after girls. Pretty much talked about girls all the time. Was always bragging about it and was always trying to find ways to have more conquest. I've often have felt from the beginning that Freddie probably inspired this whole thing in some way or shape or form.
Stories would later emerge that suggested Gore's twisted desires may have had their beginnings in the fetishes he had once indulged in private.
There were rumors that came out of David's first wife that he was into bondage. I had a theory later on that that was David's worst enemy, and that he was unable to express himself with a girl unless maybe she was tied up and gagged and had no personality to address him with.
When combined, the fantasies of David Gore and Fred Waterfield would eventually prove to be the catalyst for their murder spree.
If you have a couple of sadistic guys who hang out and get drunk, start talking about what they want to do to women, they probably made a pact that they were going to kind of live for each other, which is what it seemed like. That's a pretty volatile combination.
So did David Gore and Fred Waterfield develop their taste in hunting human game? Or were they born with their murderous bond?
In my opinion, I think this had happened over a long period of time, and the things we have in investigation, we have them involved in things going back 10 or 11 years before the time of that they were arrested in 1983, of being involved together. And again, the good guy and the bad guy, and the one would feed off the other. And they had the sexual fantasies that continued to progress and get worse as time went on.
I think that Freddie was the stronger of the two personalities. I can't imagine David doing anything without having been inspired in some way by Freddie. I've always felt like that the two personalities together is what made up the elements necessary for those crimes to flourish and become fruitful.
Gore was a born killer because I do think it was an environmental thing. I think he had brain damage, neurological damage, that probably influenced his aggression and inability to make moral decisions, as well as his association with a cousin with similar inclinations.
Fred Waterfield was the stronger personality of the two of them, and I do believe that he had the ability to influence David Gore's behavior and to plant ideas in his head. And perhaps it was where Fred learned this behavior, or maybe it was his environment, and he had these dark thoughts, and he knew he had Gore there to escalate it and turn it from fantasy to reality.
At trial, Fred Waterfield continued to plead his innocence. However, faced with a positive identification by Reagan Martin and supporting physical evidence, he was eventually found guilty of the manslaughter of Lynn Elliott and the murders of Barbara Bayer and Angelica Lavallee. He would receive multiple life sentences. David Gore was sentenced to receive the death penalty. After almost 3 decades on death row, he was executed in 2012.
While I was watching him die, I said to myself, I condemn your soul to hell. And I kept saying that in my mind. And I hope that is where it went.
Although Lynn Elliott's life was lost at the hands of David Gore, her father Carl believes her spirit lives on.
She loved this beach area. I can even talk to her here, and it helps me. It just brings her back to me a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, we feel her presence here very much.